620,000 Americans died in 4 years of civil war, more than in every other American war combined, from the Revolution through Vietnam. That number is so large it stops meaning anything. So here's a smaller number. In a single day at Antietam, September 17, 1862, 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing between sunrise and sunset. More Americans died that Tuesday than on any other day in the nation's military history. A creek ran red for miles. Farmers found bones in their fields for decades afterward. But here's what the history books don't tell you about the Civil War. The man who became the Great Emancipator, the president whose face is on the penny, whose memorial sits at the end of the National Mall, spent the first year and a half of the war insisting it had nothing to do with slavery. He offered to protect slavery permanently if the South would return. He fired generals who freed enslaved people without his permission. Abraham Lincoln was willing to preserve the most brutal institution in American history if it would keep the country together. The Civil War was not the noble crusade against slavery that American mythology made it. It was 4 years of industrialized slaughter that began as a fight over political power, transformed into something larger than anyone intended, and ended with consequences nobody fully controlled. This is the story of how a nation tore itself apart, what it actually fought about, and why the version taught in school leaves out the most important parts. By 1860, the United States had been arguing about slavery for 80 years without resolving anything. The founders had known it was a problem. Jefferson called it a fire bell in the night, and had systematically avoided confronting it, building compromises into the Constitution that allowed the contradiction between all men are created equal and a society built on human bondage to persist indefinitely. Every decade brought a new crisis, a new compromise, and a new postponement. The economics were the foundation of everything. The South's cotton economy was the engine of American prosperity in the mid-19th century. Cotton accounted for more than half of American exports, and the textile mills of Britain and New England ran on Southern fiber. This economy required enslaved labor at a scale that was staggering. By 1860, 4 million people were enslaved in the American South, representing approximately $3 billion in property, more capital than all the banks and railroads in the country combined. The Southern planter class wasn't going to surrender this voluntarily. The North's economy was fundamentally different and growing more so. Industrialization, immigration, and wage labor were creating a society where free workers competed in a market, where cities grew rapidly, and where the idea of a man rising through his own efforts, the free labor ideology, had genuine cultural power. The presence of slavery in the territories, where new states were being formed, threatened to poison this system by creating competition from unpaid labor and entrenching a planter aristocracy that Northern workers found both economically threatening and morally repugnant. The political crisis that produced the war was about territory, specifically whether slavery would expand into the western territories that the United States was rapidly acquiring. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, each attempted to resolve the territorial question, and each failed. Kansas, in the mid-1850s, became a small-scale civil war in preview, with pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers murdering each other over which version of Kansas would enter the Union. Bleeding Kansas made abstract political argument into physical violence. Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was not an abolitionist. This is crucial to understanding everything that followed. He personally found slavery morally repugnant. His private letters make this clear. But his public position was carefully limited. He opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, but he explicitly promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. He had said, repeatedly and on the record, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." The South didn't believe him. More precisely, The Southern planter class understood that a Republican president committed to containing slavery's expansion was an existential threat to their political power, regardless of what he promised about existing slave states. A contained slavery was a dying slavery. The math of Senate representation, of territorial expansion, of demographic change all ran against a slave South that couldn't grow. Lincoln's election in November 1860 was the trigger. South Carolina seceded in December. 6 more states followed before Lincoln took office in March 1861. Both sides expected it to be over in 90 days. This was the near-universal assumption in April 1861, shared by politicians, generals, and ordinary citizens on both sides of the line. The North had overwhelming advantages in population, industry, railroads, and naval power. The South had fighting spirit, better officers, and the inherent defensive advantage of fighting on home ground. Neither side understood what 4 years of industrial warfare would actually look like. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 ended the 90-day theory. Union forces advancing on the Confederate capital at Richmond were routed by Confederate troops and fled back toward Washington in disorder, their retreat tangled with civilian spectators who had driven out from the Capitol to watch what they expected to be a Union victory picnic. Confederate forces, too disorganized to pursue effectively, let them go. Washington panicked. Lincoln fired the commanding general and called in George McClellan to build a real army. Bull Run revealed something both sides would spend 4 years learning. This war would be decided not by a single dramatic battle, but by attrition, logistics, and the capacity to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The Union had enormous advantages in all of these. The Confederacy had one advantage that partially offset them all: its generals. Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, the Confederate officer corps in the war's first 2 years was arguably the finest collection of military talent on the continent. Lee, in particular, combined tactical brilliance with the ability to read his opponent's psychology and exploit hesitation with an instinct that repeatedly turned defensive situations into offensive opportunities. Against McClellan, cautious, brilliant at organization, paralyzed by overestimating Confederate strength, Lee won battle after battle despite being consistently outnumbered. Here's the fact that shatters the standard narrative. In July 1862, 15 months into the war, after tens of thousands of men had already died, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State William Seward presented Congress with a proposed constitutional amendment that would have made slavery permanent and untouchable by the federal government forever. Lincoln supported it. He personally lobbied for it. The amendment passed Congress and was sent to the states for ratification. It was called the Corwin Amendment, and if the Southern states had accepted it, if they had returned to the Union with this guarantee, the 4 million people enslaved in the American South would have remained enslaved with constitutional protection that not even a future amendment could have removed. The South rejected it. Not because the guarantee wasn't sufficient, but because secession was already in motion and the offer came too late, or because the planter class had concluded that a Southern nation was preferable to permanent union with an industrializing North regardless of slavery's formal protection. The Corwin Amendment was ratified by only 2 states, Ohio and Maryland, before the war made it irrelevant. But its existence reveals something essential about what Lincoln thought he was fighting for in 1861: the Union, not emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, the document that transformed Lincoln into the Great Emancipator in American memory, was a military measure, not a moral one. Lincoln said so himself, explicitly. It freed enslaved people only in Confederate states in rebellion, not in border states still loyal to the Union where slavery continued legally throughout the war. It freed people in areas where the Union had no practical ability to enforce it. It left enslaved people in Union-controlled areas of Louisiana and Virginia untouched. What it did was transform the war's meaning in ways that could not be reversed. By framing the war as a struggle over slavery, Lincoln made European intervention on the Confederacy's behalf politically impossible. Britain and France, whatever their economic interest in Confederate cotton, could not publicly support the slave power after the proclamation without catastrophic domestic political consequences. He also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army, which would eventually add 180,000 men to the Union cause. The proclamation was brilliant strategy dressed as moral principle. Eventually, the moral principle became real. But that wasn't how it started. The Civil War was the first industrial war, and neither side was prepared for what that meant. The rifle had replaced the musket as the standard infantry weapon, extending accurate fire from 50 yards to 300. Artillery had improved dramatically. The tactical reality of the battlefield had changed fundamentally, but the tactical thinking of the generals hadn't caught up. Officers trained on Napoleonic warfare ordered infantry charges against rifle-armed defenders in fortified positions and watched their men die in thousands. Gettysburg, in July 1863, was the war's turning point and its most concentrated expression of this disconnect. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had invaded Pennsylvania, seeking a decisive victory on Northern soil that might break Northern will to continue the war. For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces fought across Pennsylvania farmland in engagements that produced 51,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The climactic moment was Pickett's charge on July 3rd. 12,500 Confederate soldiers walked across 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward Union rifle and artillery fire. Fewer than half returned. The charge accomplished nothing except demonstrating that frontal assaults on prepared defensive positions had become suicide. Simultaneously, 1,200 miles to the southwest, Ulysses Grant was completing the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Grant had spent months maneuvering to isolate the Confederate fortress city on the Mississippi River, cutting it off from supply and reinforcement, then conducting a siege that lasted 47 days. When Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge failed at Gettysburg, the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. The Confederacy never recovered strategically. Grant was the general Lincoln had been searching for. Unlike McClellan, who saw his army as something precious to be preserved, Grant understood that the Union's advantage in manpower meant it could afford to trade casualties if it kept moving. "Find out where your enemy is," Grant said. "Get at him as soon as you can. Strike at him as hard as you can and as often as you can, and keep moving on." It was not elegant, it was effective. William Tecumseh Sherman understood the war differently than anyone else in either army. Sherman grasped that the Confederacy's real strength wasn't its armies. It was the Southern population's will to support those armies. Break that will, destroy the economic infrastructure that sustained the war effort, make the civilian population feel the war's cost directly, and the armies would have nothing left to fight for. Total war, targeting civilian morale and resources, not just enemy soldiers. Sherman's march to the sea in late 1864 put this theory into practice. From Atlanta to Savannah, his army cut a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction through Georgia, burning factories, tearing up railroads, consuming or destroying food supplies, and leaving behind a landscape that could no longer sustain Confederate military operations. He was not conducting a massacre. His orders prohibited attacks on civilians and were largely followed. But he was deliberately creating suffering and destruction on a scale that had no precedent in American warfare. "War is hell," Sherman said. He made sure Georgia understood what he meant. While the armies fought each other, two separate internal conflicts were tearing both societies apart in ways the standard military narrative barely acknowledges. In the North, opposition to the war was substantial, organized, and occasionally violent. The Democratic Party contained a significant faction, Copperheads, that argued for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. Anti-war sentiment was strongest among Irish immigrants and working-class whites who had no desire to die for black freedom and feared that emancipation would flood northern labor markets with freed people competing for their jobs. The New York City draft riots of July 1863 were the most violent expression of this opposition. When the Union instituted the first military draft in American history, with a provision allowing wealthy men to pay $300 to buy their way out, working-class New Yorkers erupted. For 4 days, mobs attacked draft offices, government buildings, and Republican newspaper offices. Then, they turned on black residents of the city with murderous violence, burning the colored orphan asylum, lynching black men from lampposts, and driving the black community from entire neighborhoods. At least 120 people died, possibly many more. The Union Army had to be pulled from Gettysburg, where it had just finished fighting, to suppress the riots with artillery and bayonets. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, authorized the military imprisonment of civilians without trial, and shut down opposition newspapers. The president, who would become the symbol of American democracy, presided over the largest suspension of civil liberties in American history. He did it because he believed the war's survival required it, and he was probably right. That doesn't make the reality less stark. The Confederacy's internal war was even more devastating. The Southern government, built on the ideology of states' rights and local autonomy, found that fighting a modern war required exactly the centralized authority that Southern ideology rejected. Confederate President Jefferson Davis instituted conscription, impressment of property, and suspension of habeas corpus, the same measures he had denounced as tyranny when Lincoln used them. Confederate governors, jealously guarding their state's autonomy, withheld troops and resources from the central government at critical moments. Class war simmered beneath the surface of Confederate society throughout the conflict. The conscription law exempted one white man per plantation with more than 20 enslaved people, the 20 Negro Law, which confirmed what poor white Southerners already suspected. This was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Desertion from Confederate armies was massive, particularly from the poorer, non-slaveholding regions of the South. Some estimates suggest that by 1864, more than a third of Confederate soldiers were absent without leave at any given time. And then there were the enslaved people themselves, 4 million men and women who were simultaneously the war's central cause and largely absent from its official narrative. They were not passive observers. As Union armies penetrated the South, enslaved people fled toward them in their hundreds of thousands, refusing to wait for a freedom that Lincoln was slow to offer. They provided Union forces with intelligence, labor, and eventually soldiers. They made the Confederacy's labor system collapse from within at the moment the Confederacy most needed it to hold. Ulysses Grant took command of all Union armies in March 1864 and immediately launched the strategy that would end the war: relentless, simultaneous pressure on every Confederate front, preventing the Confederates from shifting troops to threatened points and forcing them to fight with their reserves depleted. It was a strategy that accepted enormous Union casualties because Grant understood that the Union could replace its losses and the Confederacy could not. The Overland Campaign of May to June 1864 was the most concentrated killing the war produced. Grant's Army of the Potomac and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia fought almost continuously for 6 weeks across Virginia, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, in battles that were often decided by terrain, weather, and chance rather than tactics. At Cold Harbor, on June 3rd, Grant ordered a frontal assault that failed catastrophically, killing 7,000 Union soldiers in less than an hour. Grant later said it was the one order he most regretted. Union soldiers facing the attack at Cold Harbor pinned their names and addresses to their uniforms the night before, so their bodies could be identified. They knew what was coming. They attacked anyway. By June 1864, Grant had pinned Lee's army in a siege around Petersburg, Virginia, south of Richmond. Lee's army was too weakened to break out, too necessary to abandon. Both armies dug trenches stretching for miles, creating a landscape that looked exactly like what the Western Front would look like 50 years later. And that would influence the generation of European officers who observed it and then designed the tactics of the First World War. The siege of Petersburg lasted 9 months. In the meantime, Sherman had taken Atlanta and was burning his way to the sea. Philip Sheridan was destroying the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia's breadbasket, so thoroughly that he said a crow flying over it would need to carry its own provisions. The Confederacy was being destroyed not by being defeated in battle, but by having everything that sustained it systematically eliminated. The end came quickly once it came. Lee's army, starved and depleted, tried to break out of Petersburg in early April 1865. Grant's forces cut off the escape routes. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in a Virginia farmhouse. The meeting was brief, formal, and conducted with a dignity that both men maintained carefully. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home, officers could keep their sidearms, men who owned horses could keep them for the spring planting. The war was over. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who had watched the war's outcome and decided that assassination was the only response left. Lincoln died the following morning, April 15, 1865. He had guided the Union through 4 years of catastrophic war, had transformed from a politician willing to preserve slavery into the author of Emancipation, and had developed a plan for Reconstruction that was conciliatory rather than punitive, malice toward none, charity for all, as he had said in his second inaugural address 6 weeks before his death. Whether that plan could have worked will never be known. What replaced it was worse. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was a Tennessee Democrat who had opposed secession but also opposed black equality with every instinct he possessed. His Reconstruction policies allowed the former Confederate states to reconstitute their governments, pass black codes that effectively reimposed slavery under another name, and return to Congress the same men who had led secession. The Republican Congress eventually seized control of Reconstruction, imposed military rule on the South, and passed the 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteeing citizenship and voting rights to black Americans. It lasted roughly 10 years. Then it ended. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved a disputed presidential election, removed the last federal troops from the South. Without federal enforcement, the rights guaranteed by constitutional amendment were systematically stripped away through violence, intimidation, and legislation. By 1900, black Southerners had been effectively disenfranchised across the South. Jim Crow segregation had been written into law, and lynching had become a regularized system of racial terror that killed thousands over the following decades. The Supreme Court, in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, ratified the entire structure as constitutional. The war that killed 620,000 Americans had ended slavery. It had not ended the racial hierarchy that slavery had built, and the failure to complete Reconstruction would define American racial politics for the next century. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was, in significant ways, a second attempt to finish what Reconstruction had started and what the Compromise of 1877 had abandoned. The brother against brother image of the Civil War, which is real. The Crittenden family of Kentucky had 2 sons who became generals on opposite sides, as did many families, has served a particular narrative function in American memory. It softens the war into a family tragedy, a conflict between 2 legitimate sides with understandable grievances, where the real subject, slavery, recedes into the background and the gallantry of soldiers on both sides can be equally admired. The Lost Cause mythology, which held that the Confederacy had fought for states' rights and honor rather than slavery, and that Southern generals had been noble warriors defeated only by Northern industrial advantage, was a deliberate historical falsification constructed after the war to rehabilitate the Confederate cause and resist Reconstruction. 620,000 dead, 4 million freed, a constitutional framework for equality written into law and then abandoned for a century. A country that had to destroy itself to resolve a contradiction its founders had refused to confront, and that still hasn't fully reckoned with what the failure of Reconstruction meant and what it cost. The Civil War is the central event in American history. It is also the event Americans have worked hardest to misremember. The soldiers were brave on both sides. The cause was not equal on both sides. Holding both of those things in mind simultaneously is the minimum the dead deserve.